Howdy. Howdy. That never gets old. I'd like to welcome you all this evening to our first conversation in public policy of the academic year. We are very fortunate to have this series of speakers who give us an opportunity to bring someone with some real deep policy expertise together with a subject matter expert who can tease out even more insight from the presentation. I hope you'll find this a very illuminating and entertaining event. I'd like to recognize a few people that are really important to the Bush School and thank them very much for being here this evening. Our faculty, because it goes without saying that we're very grateful to them. I'd like to recognize Warren Finch, the director of the George Bush Presidential Library and Museum, and David Jones, the CEO of the George Bush Library Foundation, for making it possible for us to use these lovely spaces for our events. I'd also like to recognize Gerald Mumpower, because he's my department head, and if I don't recognize him, I might not ever get made full professor. So everyone please recognize Gerald Mumpower. Then William Clark, the head of the political science department, who to the best of my knowledge has no control over me, but I still am very grateful that he's here. And Soren Sorescu, my newest friend, from the head of the finance department at the Mays School of Business. So we are very grateful for their presence here this evening. And they are very much looking forward to, because they told me so, this exciting event with Manuel Sánchez González, the vice governor of the Banco de Mexico. Dr. González is a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago, which is this no-name research program up on the lakes, but yet he still seems to have become remarkably well-trained without all of that. The market has clearly recognized his stellar accomplishments and ambitions. He was the director of investment at Valenza, Mexico, the private equity unit of BBVA. He was with the Banco Financial Group, in which case he's held the roles of Director of Investment at Valenza, the Director of Financial Analysis and Investor Relations, the Director of Planning and Finance, and last but certainly not least, the Chief Economist. So we've got somebody to talk to us tonight about some really important and valuable things. And I promised that I would not take up your time because it's really his time. And I'd like to turn the stage over to him. Governor Sanchez will speak for a while, and then we will invite to the stage Dr. Raymond Robertson, one of our Bush School faculty, to probe more deeply into all of those issues and concerns. So please join me in welcoming Governor Sanchez.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this very nice and entertaining presentation. Let me begin by saying that it's really a pleasure for me and an honor to participate in this series Conversations in Public Policy, held by the Mosbacher Institute at the Bush School at Texas A&M University. The occasion is important for at least two reasons. Texas A&M is a world-renowned educational and research center with a 140-year history, and it is also located in the state with the most significant social and economic connections to Mexico. The long-standing relationship between the Lone Star State and Mexico is deeply rooted in common cultural and social heritage. Today, I would like to talk first about the long-term economic ties between the United States, in particular Texas and Mexico. Second, I will focus on financial markets and challenges. Third, I will examine recent economic developments and the outlook. And finally, discuss inflation and monetary policy in my country, Mexico. As usual, as all central bankers like to say, my remarks tonight are entirely my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Bank of Mexico or its governing board. Mexico has long been in a process of increasing economic integration with the United States, encompassing goods and services, capital, and labor markets. These links, reinforced by the North American Free Trade Agreement, have yielded substantial benefits on both sides of the border, including, obviously, more competition, efficiency, job creation, and consumer well-being. The most significant bond with any state is obviously with Texas, given its place as the 10th largest economy in the world and the extensive border it shares with Mexico. In terms of trade of goods, the United States is Mexico's most important partner in both imports and exports, while Mexico is second in exports and imports for the United States. Texas, however, is number one in both categories for Mexico and vice versa. The backdrop to bilateral merchandise trade is a long-term growing industrial integration between the two countries. In particular, Mexico's manufacturing production holds an extraordinarily high correlation with US manufacturing output. Also, the United States and Texas in particular are important providers of foreign direct investment to Mexico, transferring technology and know-how while exploiting mutually advantageous business opportunities. In fact, Mexico is the second most important destination for Texan foreign direct investment, following only Canada. Finally, Mexico's net labor migration to the United States and Texas has been significant over the years. However, Mexican net labor flows to the United States have diminished notably since 2008 and have been negative in some years recently. Several factors may be behind this phenomenon, including falling fertility rates in Mexico, but also cyclical factors such as low growth in US economic sectors, which typically have been Mexican labor absorbers, for example, construction, as well as rising employment in Mexico. Worker remittances from the United States dropped amid the global financial crisis and since 2010 have exhibited a discontinuous recovery, reaching pre-crisis nominal levels only recently. These money transfers contribute substantially to the standard of living of many families in Mexico, helping them to meet basic needs such as longer schooling and better housing. Going forward, it is only natural that social and economic integration between the two countries augment. An increasing array of opportunities will continue from the current reform agenda undertaken by Mexico. Telecom and energy reforms are already making themselves felt. The latter is especially important for an energy powerhouse such as Texas. Since the middle of 2014, risk aversion has increased, hitting emerging markets especially hard. A reflection of this has been a decline in the prices of many commodities and emerging market financial assets, including some upward pressure on interest rates, but more persistently, widespread downward pressure on currency levels against the US dollar. Behind this shift are various factors, beginning with worries about or over the state of the Chinese economy and policy moves there to handle any problems, any deterioration. Also, geopolitical developments such as Brexit may have had a part. However, the most important by far has been uncertainty over imminent US monetary policy normalization. Market expectations and the beginning of normalization have had significant implications for financial flows for emerging economies. Around the world, US monetary accommodation fueled the search for yield through significant portfolio capital inflows to emerging markets. But since 2014, however, these flows have slowed, turning negative in some recent quarters. Furthermore, data-driven US monetary policy has generated financial volatility. Portfolio capital flows are highly sensitive to revised expectations of changes in US policy rates. Additionally, asset prices react rapidly to any economic news. If the perception is of a stronger than expected economy, they tend to fall in anticipation of tighter policy and vice versa. Mexican financial markets have adjusted to this environment mainly through the exchange rate. Long-term interest rates, low by historical standards, have remained relatively stable since an upward adjustment back in 2013 in the wake of the infamous taper tantrum. Along with other emerging market currencies, the Mexican peso has depreciated significantly since 2014. However, during the present year, the weakening of the currency has been more substantial than in other emerging economies. In addition to fears surrounding US hikes, other aspects more specific to Mexico seem to be at play. A first contributing factor is Mexico's weak fiscal position. Over the last several years, the historical balance of public sector borrowing requirements relative to GDP has been persistently rising to reach around 50% in 2016. Also, financial deterioration in state-owned oil company Pemex, due in large part to lower international oil prices, has been a concern. The fiscal gap has been mirrored in a widening current account deficit, mainly reflecting the oil trade account. Mexico's fiscal finances, may be on unsustainable path, and the public debt ratio appears to have reached a limit at levels that may not be healthy. Relative government indebtedness is already higher than in many other emerging markets. Also, Mexico's sovereign credit risk perception, as measured by CDS premiums, has remained above that of other countries with the same rating. Furthermore, rating agencies have given Mexico a clear warning that this year, in the form of a downward change in perspective. A second possible contributing factor to peso depreciation this year may be markets' disappointment on lower than expected economic growth in Mexico. A third cause may stem from uncertainty on the forthcoming US presidential election and its implications. Finally, given the depth and liquidity of the peso market and the fact that derivatives are used to hedge peso positions and as a proxy for other emerging market asset investments, price swings for the Mexican currency may be exacerbated. Volatility could easily increase in the future in light of so many unknown global geopolitical and financial variables. This situation could be even more risky in the face of Mexico's high exposure to foreign holdings of peso-denominated government debt. These holdings represent one of the highest proportions of the total outstanding of local currency debt in the emerging market group, decreasing somewhat during the last couple of years at close to a third, with the drop concentrated mainly in short-term securities. The still high ratios of foreign holdings could be interpreted as a positive sign. The tables could rapidly turn, however, if perception of strength evaporates. Therefore, it is absolutely urgent that Mexico strengthen its fiscal stance in an unambiguous way, cutting public expenditure significantly in order to stabilize and eventually reduce total government debt to GDP. Obviously, monetary policy should also continue to carry its weight in the effort to fortify macroeconomic fundamentals. Since 2014, GDP has risen at a relatively stable rate of around 2.3% year on year, including a dip in the 2016 second quarter. Two offsetting forces have contributed: expansion in services and decelerating industrial production. Recently, the pace has slowed in both sectors. The main drag on industrial output has been a contraction in mining, driven by a long-standing decline in oil extraction. Manufacturing production has also been slowing to almost no growth recently. To a large extent, these developments have resulted from a falling trend in US manufacturing production and a contraction in manufacturing exports to the United States since 2015, despite the significant real depreciation of the Mexican peso against the dollar. Less manufacturing dynamism seems to have begun to affect important segments of the services sector, such as commerce and transportation, highly correlated with manufacturing, a worrisome event given that the services sector has been a key growth engine in the past few years. On the demand side, Mexico's economic slowdown is evident in lower increases in private consumption, and especially a decelerating trend in total investment. Analyst consensus forecasts are for a transitory loss of vigor in the Mexican economy this year, forecasting around 2% rate of growth for this year, followed by a growth figure slightly below the historical average in 2017, around 2.5%. The economic scenario, however, faces risks, among which those to the downside, in my view, seem to prevail. In the short term, possible negative effects include a deeper deceleration for the global economy and US manufacturing production, additional reductions in Mexican oil extraction, and softer business confidence and private investment. In the medium term, dangers encompass obstacles to adequate implementation of structural reforms, where education stands out, as well as growing international protectionism. Since 2015, inflation in Mexico has exhibited benign behavior. In annual terms, it has converged to the 3% target established by the Banco of Mexico more than 10 years ago. Furthermore, and in stark contrast with previous trends, inflation has been continuously below the target for at least for over a year. Subdued headline inflation has been supported by unusually reduced rises in the non-core component of the CPI. Specifically, since the middle of last year, non-core inflation has averaged only 2.3%, contrasting with the roughly 6% average during this century. Remember, this has to do with a lot of agricultural prices that have been depressed internationally. That has been a good luck for our inflation behavior. On the other hand, core inflation has been growing gradually this year, largely reflecting moderate pass-through from currency depreciation to tradable goods prices. So far, this effect has been relatively mild, and core inflation has not breached 3%. In addition, exchange rate pass-through to merchandise prices has been somewhat compensated by lower telecom prices, reflecting more competition in the sector as a result of one of the important structural reforms in Mexico, which is the telecom reform. Two warning signals that would argue against continued consumer price stability are a rising trend in producer price changes, which could be partly translated to final goods eventually, and an interruption in convergence of medium-term inflation expectations to the target as measured by analyst surveys. Currently, those expectations were moving towards the 3% target. They sort of got stagnated around 3.5%. Upside risks to inflation appear to dominate. The largest concern relates to the possibility of higher contagion from Mexican peso weakening, which could generate deviation of inflation and expectations from the target. Sudden increases in pass-through cannot be ruled out, or what economists elegantly call the presence of non-linearities. Two other risks are the reversion of non-core inflation to its historical mean, with possible second-round effects. The potential emergence of aggregate demand pressures are also important given uncertainty regarding the true level of potential GDP. Throughout recent years, monetary policy in Mexico has been conducted in alignment with the primary objective of sustained price stability. Consistently, since December 2015, the policy rate has been raised 3 times for a total of 125 basis points. These moves were preemptive, as inflation, fortunately, has remained under control. The hikes sought to fortify macroeconomic fundamentals in conjunction with announced government expenditure cuts and to avert deviation of inflation expectations from the target that may arise from pass-through. Going forward, the implications of exchange rate developments will remain an important input in monetary policy decisions. But let us be clear. The Bank of Mexico does not target any exchange rate level, and hence, there does not exist a benchmark value at which monetary policy would react. This doesn't mean, however, that the effects of currency behavior are irrelevant. They will continue to be taken into account to the extent that they may impact inflation and expectations. Other factors considered by monetary policy include the state of the economy and the relative monetary stance vis-à-vis that of the United States, especially important given the close nature of the US-Mexican relationship. In short, monetary policy must remain on guard. Its lags are long and variable. It will continue to be implemented with all the flexibility timeliness, and independence required to consolidate price stability. Let me conclude. As with the United States as a whole, Texas and Mexico continue to enjoy long-standing and profound cultural, social, and economic ties. Mutual benefits accrue on both sides of the border from bilateral trade, as well as capital and labor investments. Ongoing structural reforms in Mexico should enhance this process. Significant not only for Mexico, but for the larger emerging market universe is the influence of US monetary policy. Shifting expectations for US policy moves have tended to fuel volatility in global financial assets, with prices tending to move in the opposite direction of economic news. Mexican markets have adjusted to changes in views on US monetary policy normalization, mainly through the exchange rate. The Mexican peso has depreciated more than other emerging market currencies this year, with idiosyncratic factors partly responsible for this trend. Mexico's economic dynamism faces downside risks, particularly those coming from slowing US manufacturing production. Also, given a context of greater risk aversion, which could become worse, Mexico needs to reinforce its fiscal stance. Monetary policy, for its part, will continue to be implemented with flexibility and timeliness, keeping at bay dangers to sustain convergence of inflation to the permanent target. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite to the stage our own Dr. Raymond Robertson, a professor and holder of the Helen and Roy Rowe Chair in Economics and Government in the Department of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service. I would like to point out that Dr. Robertson is also the director of our program in globalization at the Mosbacher Institute for Trade, Economics, and Public Policy, so a key member of our team, and is currently chairing the U.S. Department of Labor's National Advisory Committee for Labor Provisions in the U.S. Free Trade Agreements. So he has a real useful and interesting perspective. He does a lot of research that is very relevant to the Mexican economy, and I'm very much looking forward to a conversation in public policy between these two esteemed gentlemen.
Lieutenant Governor, thank you very much.
It's going to be in Spanish.
Right.
Your Spanish is much better than mine.
Empezamos en español entonces, por el beneficio de todos que están aquí. We had agreed not to have the conversation in Spanish, just for most of you who are here. But I did want to say, extend my own personal special welcome and thank you so much. It's a great honor for us to have you here tonight and to have you participate in this conversation in public policy. I think it's great for the Bush School and for A&M. So thank you very much for joining us here. I really enjoyed your talk quite a bit. I think it's really important that you highlight this close relationship that we have between Mexico and the United States. The title of your talk was Mexico as a regional leader, right? And I think it would be interesting to dive a little bit more into some of the reforms that Mexico's been undertaking that really put it apart from the rest of Latin America. So I think it was last year, the OECD recognized Mexico as the most successful country in implementing reforms of all the countries in the OECD. And we only touched a little bit upon those in your talk. Would you care to elaborate a little bit more and tell us a little bit more broadly about the reforms Mexico's been undertaking lately?
Yeah, of course. I think the starting point is the recognition that Mexico's economic growth has been disappointing everybody, including market participants and observers. And behind that disappointment is the recognition that Mexico hasn't been growing faster as an emerging economy should be doing because of a problem of productivity. Our economy has traditionally been facing a lot of obstacles to be more efficient, and a lot of obstacles also to do more investment in many sectors that were actually close to private investment, national and foreign investment. So from that recognition of the problem of total factor productivity is that the present administration put together an agenda, an ambitious agenda to modernize the economy, to free the economy from many obstacles for higher efficiency, and had the leadership to convince all the political parties in the country. So they put together in the legislation a big agenda of structural reforms. The structural reforms cover many sectors of the economy, including the labor market, including education, including energy, of course, telecommunication, competition itself, the financial system, which is not the most competitive financial system in the world, and also the fiscal reform. Those are the most important reforms that were undertaken. They were passed by Congress in an amazingly short period of time. There was a lot of consensus, I guess, from these commonly held diagnostics of the problem underlying the disappointing growth of the economy. So there was enough consensus already gathered around the agenda. And now is Mexico in the process of the implementation. The implementation is probably more important, and implementation of the reforms is probably more important than just passing the legislation. But let me say one thing that makes us perhaps a little bit optimistic about the future of Mexico is the fact that this is the first time that Mexico decided to make some substantial reforms without having any financial crisis. At least any financial crisis generated by itself. I mean, because we sort of were very much experts at generating our own balance of payments crisis and fiscal crisis. And all the time after the crisis, we needed to make some adjustments. Typically, they were the fiscal-led kind of adjustments just to stabilize financially the economy. But this time was different. As the title of the famous book is this time was actually different in that sense that the reforms were driven by this recognition of a problem of a long-term productivity stagnation. Now, as it was perhaps expected, the implementation has been relatively fluid in some areas, and some other areas have faced significant challenges from vested interests. And one particular area that has been a little bit or a lot problematic has been the educational reform, but I guess the direction of the reforms is the correct one. We have to be patient. That in my conversation with students, I said there are two things that we have to keep in mind about structural reforms. One, the effects are long term, so you have to be patient. And the second one is in the middle of the implementation. There may be some losers in that, and some pain, as it is the case whenever you open any sector for competition and new players. And the two things more or less being put together in the process.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's really important. I think one of the things you mentioned in your talk was the rising debt to GDP ratios. And in this package of reform, there was also a fiscal reform, right, that included tax increases. Could you just elaborate a little bit for us about how we could have passed fiscal reform in Mexico and had increasing tax revenues and yet still have the rising debt?
Well, let me first say that Mexico shouldn't be regarded as a country that already finished its homework. I think we had a good process, but the process is still going on. Mm-hmm. So I always feel fearful about being considered a miracle or an example for other countries, because we have to remain alert and on guard, just to declaring victory. It's not what you mean, but it's we need time. We need to make the right implementation of those reforms. Mm-hmm. But having said that, I guess there was another recognition about the fiscal situation in Mexico. That was that traditionally the tax revenues relative to GDP, for instance, were amazingly lower than the average. Will be perhaps is probably one of the lowest in Latin America and among emerging market economies. Mm-hmm. There is a huge underground economy. There were a lot of loopholes and a lot of exceptions for paying taxes. So out of recognizing a reality, there was this fiscal reform or tax reform that perhaps did not leave everybody happy. It's not in a situation where you raise taxes. It's very likely that a lot of people feel uncomfortable, unhappy, and that. And also, it is always possible to imagine a much better fiscal reform than the one we had. But having said that, the reform was actually effective in the sense that there was a significant gain in tax collections. So this is why it's so important, the other part of what you said, that in spite of the fact that there has been this gain in tax revenues relative to GDP, in spite of that, there has been this sort of worrisome trend in total GDP, to total debt to GDP. Remember, the levels are still moderate relative to most advanced countries. 50% ratio of public debt to GDP is good. It's actually much low. It's lower than the benchmark for entering the European Union.
And much lower than the United States.
Exactly,
now,
exactly.
So, right.
But we are not the United States, as you can imagine. I mean, we are not. We don't have this privilege of having the world currency, world reserve currency. We are not a developed country. We are still an emerging economy. So we have to be careful with our management of public finances and in general, the financial health of the economy. So what is worrisome so far is not so much the level, although I said that perhaps we reached already a level of 50% that may not be that healthy, especially in comparison with other emerging market economies. But what is more worrisome is the trend. I mean, it has been in a short period of time, this rising of debt, and the Ministry of Finance is very much aware of that. And they are proposing, they have been implementing expenditure cuts, and they are conscious of that they have to consolidate their fiscal position. Some of that, we were talking about that perhaps in the afternoon. Some of that is just automatically a result of the peso depreciation and the fraction that Mexico has of foreign debt, or debt denominated in foreign currency, not mainly US dollars. So that part is playing against this ratio, but this rising trend has been going on for some years. And even if we just take a look at the natural the automatic or mechanic effect that this currency effect has on the total debt, well, you owe U.S. dollars. You have to pay more in terms of pesos. So that's a real burden that the government has. Where no matter what maybe you're not very lucky this time, but you have to take that into account.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's also a role for the falling price of oil, right? The low oil prices are affecting government revenues as well.
Yeah.
And there was hope that the energy reform would have brought more investment into deep sea investing, but we haven't really seen that materialize as much as hoped yet. Is that true?
Okay. Well, it has been. This hasn't been the best possible time for the oil or energy reform, as you can imagine. The prices are not in their highest, although they are not in the lowest either.
No,
but, let me say again that, a couple of comments to your question. One is that going back to the rising trend of public debt to GDP, the government has been hedging budgeted oil revenues in the international market, so that hasn't been the main reason for the deterioration of the debt to GDP. Mm-hmm. So whatever they budgeted, they get it at the end because they hedge their position. But having said that, remember any reform yields effects in the long term, and some effects may show up early on, but some may take longer. I refer to the results that are really evident in Mexico in terms of the declining prices in the telecom industry. That has been amazingly persistent. That has been going on for several years. That translates into a much better connected economy. Telecommunications are, as you know, a very important input for being more productive, and that's getting continuously more and more economical to have access to internet and to have telephone lines and all that. We were talking about when you went to Mexico several years ago. It used to be a state monopoly, the telephony company. Telmex used to take about a year to give you a fixed line telephone in your home, and that's obviously that was before the cellular, the mobile telephones were popular. But anyway, there has been a significant and obvious, evident improvement in that particular industry. But in the energy sector, we have had a lot of participation of private investors. But being here in Texas, you are aware that those things take several years, to produce results and to extract oil. And remember also, the energy reform is not only about the extraction of oil, it's also the transportation of natural gas, the production of natural gas, the participation, the competitive market for private participants in the electricity sector, many areas within that energy market, but that may be even benefited by low oil prices, but that's we need to continue being patient for seeing the benefits, the quantifiable benefits.
Well, I'm really glad to hear you talk about the importance of the long term and taking a very patient view, because I hope you'll indulge me in being a little more optimistic than I think maybe you were in your talk. Because I think of Mexico 25 years ago, and you think of the monetary policies that they had 25 years ago and the control of the exchange rates and the money supplies. it's a radically different monetary policy. I think that you should really be congratulated. Can you talk a little bit more about the success in macroeconomic management through monetary policy in the last, say, decade, instead of the last couple of years, the last decade or so?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that. I guess central bankers are being paid for being conservative and perhaps not that optimistic about their own achievements. But certainly, there is a huge difference with what Mexico looked like 25 years ago, particularly on the inflation front. Remember, Mexico had in the 1980s, the annual inflation rate reached more than 160% in 1980, February 1988. That was a year-on-year figure that I cannot forget. And we used to entertain, by the way, among other Latin American countries, we were talking about that in the afternoon. We used to entertain these Latin American theories that we were different than other countries. So we had to invent new ways for controlling inflation. So we went to Brazil and we went to Argentina to look for these heterodox policies, while Volcker had already controlled inflation, but in the traditional way. We wanted something, for control of inflation with no pain. So we invented these incomes policies, and we basically froze prices, and we called that the Pact for Stability. But at the end, that came with the anchor of the exchange rate that allowed a huge accumulation of the current account deficit that ended with a big disequilibrium in the financial system, the very weak origination of loans in the banking system, and with the famous tequila crisis. So we finally realized that perhaps we should not invent new theories, and if there is a monetary phenomenon behind that, we have to control that monetary phenomenon. So we realized that it was much better, more practical, and at the beginning it was just a practical issue, just to let the exchange rate float. It was a practical issue because international reserves were actually negative, so there was no possibility for the central bank to intervene in the foreign exchange market. So we let the exchange rate float. That was thought at the time to be a transitory decision. Then maybe we will go back to the fixed rate system. But at the end, we found out that it was a rather good idea to let that important price to adjust or help the economy adjust to international shocks. And also later on, the central bank was granted autonomy, so that we were not allowed anymore to finance the government, the fiscal deficit, which, by the way, was one of the obvious reasons why we were not able to control inflation in the previous regime. So at the end, we followed what everybody else was doing. I mean, targeting inflation, getting committed to a particular target. We are inflation targeters, and we committed to a 3% rate of inflation. And finally, with some time, we feel that inflation finally converged to the target, and is more or less the inflation expectations are well anchored. I was talking about more like just the situation is good. You have to be very jealous and very have to be on guard. Mm-hmm. So that, because if it took you a long time and a lot of pain and a lot of failures and a lot of crises just to get to that situation, you have to be very careful at not losing that territory. I think we only have 5 minutes.
Sounds Sounds great. Well, I just have one other question, and this is important, I think, for Texas. I'm very tempted to say that I'm hearing from your comments that understanding economics is very important for public policy. Is that might be, you might agree with that?
I hope so.
You would hope
Well,
so.
I studied in economics, so
Exactly. But one of the other areas, just to mention this quickly, was Mexico's importance in international trade, right? So you mentioned the close relationship with the United States, but Mexico's been pursuing trade agreements with many, many other countries,
Yeah.
right? So how important has Mexico's trade relationship been in promoting economic growth?
absolutely important. I think it made the economy and the economic system more formal, the rules of the game more predictable. Mexico has been undertaking many of these international trade agreements as a way of formalizing the intention to be an open economy, a predictable economy, an economy that welcomes foreign investment and foreign trade. Mm-hmm. And let me say, by far, obviously, the North American Free Trade Agreement has been extremely beneficial and is by far the most important agreement that we have signed for many years.
That's fantastic. Just as one last minute, do you have any advice for the students studying public policy as they go forward, especially for looking to strengthen relationships between the United States and Mexico? Any words of advice from your experience?
Yeah. That's difficult.
That was the hardest question. I saved the hardest one for last.
I think to be in a school like this, where practical problems are being examined, not just theory. A good theory is the most practical instrument for a policymaker. But good theory by itself is insufficient. So being in a school like Texas A&M, where practical problems are entertained and examined and not only theory, it's a good combination, an excellent combination to prepare yourselves for the real world. And that's my, I wouldn't say my advice, it's just the recognition that you are in the right place.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Governor Sánchez.
And we want to very much thank our two distinguished conversationalists for making sure we were in the right place this evening. This is great. We'd like to make sure that Governor Sanchez doesn't forget about us. So we have prepared a small plaque suitable for hanging on an appropriate wall. So I'd like to make sure to thank him very graciously for a lovely evening and a very entertaining opportunity. We'd like to thank you all for coming and wish you a very good evening. Good night.